and welcome to my 2022 interview series called Women of Global Interest. If you're joining us for the first time, thank you. And if you're joining us for many times that you've been with us this year, thank you so much also. This is the final of 7 interviews for this year's series where I sought out women from around the world who are trailblazers making an important contribution to inspire and empower others, especially other women. Now, today's guest is Heidi Evans, and she joins us from Paris. Hello, Heidi. I know it's evening there. Thank you for being with us. How are you?
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir. And how is the holiday season shaping up in Paris? Because I was there at this time last year, and it's just incredible.
Lots of trees, lots of Christmas trees, lots of lights, some Christmas markets. In fact, loads of Christmas markets.
Paris has a lot of Christmas markets, which is awesome. But the lights everywhere, right? You know, like the Hotel de Ville, all the stores, everything is just fabulous.
Yeah, it's not a good place to be epileptic.
Well, we're going to have a look at that a little bit later. But before I introduce you in full, let's just say hello to Mark, who is producing this segment along with my team in Vancouver. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Diana. Always a pleasure to see you. Nice to see you, Heidi. Nice to meet you.
Well, Mark is going to be monitoring the Q&A sections of this interview because I really would like to encourage you to send any questions for Heidi during the broadcast, and we will get to those. We'll also be using the chat for three giveaways at the end of the broadcast, so wait for that too. So let me tell you about this very interesting woman. Heidi is originally from London, England. She studied English literature at the University of York in North Yorkshire. She moved to Paris in 2014 in search of a new adventure, and man, that's such a good idea. Heidi's background is in public relations, but she also teaches English as a second language, and she's worked as a tour guide where her love for Paris just blossomed. Heidi developed a fascination for all things French and a genuine joy for what she's doing, and so in 2016, she decided to create her own tour company called Women of Paris. She was inspired to do so because she realized that this is a grossly neglected topic in Paris tourism. You know, typical tours of the city are dominated by the men, by great men, Napoleon, Louis XIV, Victor Hugo, Gide, people like that, and don't often include much reference to great women. So Heidi began researching and was amazed by the rich diversity of names she came across, from singer like Josephine Baker, who I've talked a lot about in my blogs, to physicist Marie Curie, but also to a wealth of literary women, some lesser celebrated, who have richly impacted the city. So Heidi has created the first Paris walking tours devoted entirely to women's history and influence, and we're going to talk about that today. So welcome once again, Heidi.
Hello.
So let's get right to it. Okay, so tell me a little bit more about, why you found this such a neglected area, even probably in education in France, but also as a tour, a walking tour.
I think because I already had my background in tourism and was working as a tour guide, giving a number of different tours all over Paris. I used to do tours of the Louvre Museum. I used to do tours of the Musée d'Orsay. And I just found myself getting increasingly frustrated with this narrative that was dominated by, as you say, the great men. And then the women were kind of either getting pushed to the side or they were being cast in a negative light. And I think if you think about some of the most famous women, historical French women, they have been very much kind of villainized by historians in the past. So that's really where the idea for Women of Paris came from. Initially, it was just one walking tour. I sat down and I researched and put together one walking tour, which was just not enough. I mean, of course, you can't, get all of women's history and put it into one tour.
No.
You wouldn't do that for men. You wouldn't go to a city like Paris and create the men's history tour.
No. I think we actually have some video, a little bit of you doing a tour or two as well. We can show that. But yeah, there you are out in, it looks like in the evening somewhere, right?
Yeah, that was in the evening. That would have been last autumn. And I'm wearing a jacket that was actually gifted to me for that I did for a German clothing brand. I thought that was a fun jacket.
Oh, fun.
Like on
Yeah.
a safari.
And nobody else does these walking tours. So why was that so important to you that you do this?
Well, it's actually not true that no one else does walking tours today. When I started running Women of Paris back in 2016, I was the only person.
Ah, so they've copied you.
Okay, I mean,
Right.
that's the highest form of flattery, I guess.
No
Uh,
kidding.
but I also just think that it's great that women's stories are being told.
Yeah.
So see them so much as my competition or as we're in the same boat. We're in the same team. We're trying to achieve the same goal. But they're called Feminists of Paris, this other company
Yes.
for the
Well,
business that.
you have a number of tours and some new ones, which we're going to talk about, but I thought we'd start with the one that I kind of took. I know you've added a few things to it. So let's just put it's called the Sugar and Spice Tour, which is perfectly appropriate for this time of year. And before we get into the details about the women that you featured along that route, we're going to take people just on what that route looks like and where it starts. So let's put up the next slide where it shows you, okay, this is the starting point. Heidi, tell us about this, because this is one of the most fascinating areas of Paris.
Yeah, so this is just on the left bank, so on the right, on the, south side of the river, the river Seine, that divides the city in two. And this area called Saint-Germain-des-Prés, literally meaning Saint Germain of the Meadows, because for a very long time, this area was actually outside of the city. This to have a wall around it, right up until the beginning of the 19th century. Beginning of the 20th century was when they kind of knocked down the last bit of the wall. But yeah, for a long time it was sitting outside of the city's walls, and this was an area that kind of developed slowly over time. In the 19th century and then leading into the 20th century, this became a sort of hotspot for writers and artists. It became a very cultural neighborhood. I mean, this was where a lot of French artists and writers hung out, but also internationals as well.
Well,
And
you can see the restaurant there that's very famous. Look at the two red dots. The big red dot, folks, is where we started the tour, which is right near one of the oldest churches in Paris. And then across the street from that is Les Deux Magots, which is a very famous restaurant where people like Hemingway, de Beauvoir, and people like that hung out, right, Heidi?
yeah, exactly. So that's this is the kind of clientele that you would get at these restaurants, because these are the kind of people living in the area and hanging out in the area. And today, because of its fame, you will be spending a lot of money at De Magot.
That's true. I remember a cup of coffee is about $15 Canadian or US. So anyway, so let's start the tour from that point. The next slide will show you where we started, and we started walking up to get to Rue de Jacob. It goes by this jazz place that I've never been. You can see the dot there. What's it called? Papa something or other. But anyway, tell us about, we went to a bookstore there, right?
So we went to number 35 Rue Jacob, which is where you will find, so you go off the street and you go down a little passageway with beautiful flower arrangements and plants. And then you have behind some glass doors, you have a beautiful space called the women's space, the Espace des Femmes. And it's actually made up of three things. You have a publisher's there, you have a bookshop, which is on the Rue Jacob, and you have a gallery space as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a publisher's first, and that was opened in 1973 by one of the founding members of the women's liberation movement in France, a woman called Antoinette Fouque. And it was actually the first publishers devoted entirely to publishing women authors, and the first bookshop which sold specifically women's writing as well, women's literature. If I'm talking too much with my hands, you can
No,
tell me.
no, it's fascinating because I go to that bookstore almost every time I go to Paris. So it is really, really well known, that bookshop. So let's go to the next slide where we start to go along Rue de Jacob. And you can see now at the top there, we're moving along that street. We're not going to talk a lot about the writer that Colette for a minute because we're going to come back to that. But this is a beautiful street with there's a boulangerie, which is a bakery there, named after Josephine Baker, right, Heidi? And a few other things along there. Very interesting.
There's a La Durée, which is that tea room and where the French macaron was invented.
Yeah. Love that. Let's go to the next slide because we're coming up to, she has what she calls a tasting along this, Sugar and Spice, after the name. So tell us about that. I remember going in there. That was amazing.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give you the full name of the tour. It's the Sugar and Spice and Women Who Write tour. I was thinking about that poem, the poem about little girls are made of sugar and spice and all things nice and little boys and slugs and snails and puppy dog's tails. That's where I got the idea from.
Oh, wonderful.
And, so it's Women Who Write, of course, women writers. And we have these tastings. So we have 2 tastings on this tour. This one, we go to a place called Le Roux, Maison Le Roux, and Henri Le Roux was a chocolate maker who invented the caramel beurre salé, the salted butter caramel.
Oh, that's right.
And it is just
delicious.
So delicious. It doesn't get stuck in your teeth, which you can't say for most caramels.
Oh, that's true. But that's a very favored spot on the tour. So let's go to the next one where, again, we visit another very famous woman who we'll get into in a minute. And notice that she has a male name. We'll tell you about that. But that's up the street, right?
Yeah. So, well, that's actually around it's kind of perpendicular to the Rue Jacob on the Rue de Seine. Beautiful street, lots of galleries on that street, booksellers, very nice street, and leading down to the River Seine.
Yeah, and let's go to the next slide then. Okay. So this I found very interesting. We went through, of course, Paris, and I've written a blog about this, has a number of covered passages and other passages. And this is another one that you took me through to get down to the next area.
Yes, this. So shall I just tell you a little bit about the passageways, especially in regards to women's history and the emancipation of women. So this passageway that you're just seeing there in the picture is one of the older passageways of Paris, dating back to the 1800s. During the 19th century reconstruction of Paris under Haussmann, a lot of them were knocked down, and then some of them were rebuilt or new ones were rebuilt. So most passageways actually date back to that period, but this one is older. And at that time, so in the 1800s, the streets of Paris were, in the 1700s, 18th century, the streets of Paris were absolutely filthy. I mean, you wouldn't want to be visiting Paris in the 17th century. And these streets were so disgusting that women of high society were not allowed to walk in them. They were too it wasn't appropriate for these women to be getting out of their carriages and walking around the streets. But because these passageways were paved, they could. So they could get out their carriages, they could have a stroll down these passages, they could meet with their friends, and they just had a little bit, this kind of afforded them a little bit more autonomy than they'd had.
Yeah, and they could do their shopping, they could stop at a restaurant, meet their friends, that kind of thing, right?
Socializing, yeah, exactly.
And so at the end of that passageway, there's another tasting, which is called the Maison Georges Larmicourt. And then we go down further to the last stop, more or less, here, which again, we won't get into, but it has something to do with a bookstore. And this is the front of the bookstore. So and that's on 12 Rue de Lyon, which is amazing. So let's get into more depth now with 3 women that were featured on this tour that I found their stories just fascinating and so interesting to actually go and visit where they live. So let's go to the next set of slides and see our first. Yeah. So tell us about Colette, and that was her pen name, right?
So that was her pen name, and she kind of followed the example of her first husband, who wrote under the name Willie.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually how her first 4 novels were published under his name. So Colette, the house that we stop outside of on the Jacob.
That's in the next slide. We can show that too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There we
So
go.
that one, that was her first Parisian residence. So this is where she moves into when she's newly married to Willie. I mean, his full name was Henry Gauthier Villard, but everybody called him Willie, and that was his pen name. He had a team of ghost writers, and she becomes his most successful. So she writes a series, 4 books, all recounting the life of a girl called Claudine. And Claudine's life is kind of closely related to Colette's own life. So she leans on her own experiences to inspire these novels. But yeah, for the whole time, I mean, up until much, much later, they believed that Willie was the author of these novels.
Really interesting. Yeah, and was that what it was like for women in those days, right?
I think, I think now more and more we are discovering where women's history has been either untold or even erased. I guess in the case of Colette, we can't be too critical of Willie, although he was problematic in many ways, but we should be critical of him because I mean, she even said, I wouldn't necessarily have become a writer if it wasn't for Willie.
Okay.
So I guess giving her the opportunity to write and also maybe the confidence as well. But taking the credit for those first 4 novels, not ideal, really.
Not ideal, no. I just want to point out too that little plaque that you see in the middle of the last slide there, we'll go back to it, is actually over top now, the apartment. Has that been there for a long time? Or was that something recent that was put up, over the last few years or whatever?
That certainly has been there as long as I've been in Paris. I think that's been there for quite a number of years. I mean, Colette has been well renowned, and since even in her lifetime she was not just a novelist, she was a journalist as well.
Yeah.
And
let's show the next slide to show the book that we probably all read or seen the movie. Colette actually wrote Gigi, which is probably one of my favorite movies. So, and then in the next slide you'll see also she had a plethora of books that she wrote, 50 plus books, plus as you say.
I find Gigi quite problematic, I'm going to be honest.
Oh, okay. Well, tell us why. Yeah.
Certainly the film, the musical, certainly the character of Honoré, by Maurice Chevalier, singing about little girls and how they grow up so quickly, and it's just really perverted for me, and I just find it really kind of, but I guess Colette didn't shy away from more scandalous themes, and she was also living in that world. She was not just a writer, she was also a performer. She performed in places like the Moulin Rouge, and so she was living and kind of moving in a circle that was not so respectable in inverted commas. So I think that's also what makes her such a fascinating person, not just writing beautifully, but also living a really countercultural and quite courageous life as well.
Yeah, well, that's true of the next person we're going to talk about. Let's put up her slide. Here is this woman, George Sand, who had quite a different name, but George Sand became her pen name. Tell us about that, Heidi. You can see the 2 pictures, very different pictures of her too in this slide.
Yeah, so that's how I like to start talking about her, with the picture of her in the blue, where she looks, very kind of conventional, like every other woman in France at that time.
Mm.
Um, and her full name was Amandine Lucille Aurore Dupin. Um, she had quite an unconventional background, though. I mean, she was related to the Polish royalty on her father's side, and they had, aristocratic like connections as well.
Mm.
But her mother was working class, and I think that gave her a sense, quite a kind of mixed sense of her identity. She also had a very liberal childhood in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But then at 18 years old, she was married. And this is, I think, quite a big turning point in her life, because she realized in getting married how awful marriage was.
Mm.
And this is really unsurprising, because she's born the same year that Napoleon Bonaparte is crowned in 1804.
Mm-hmm.
Same year that Napoleon introduces his civil code. And under the civil code,
Mm-hmm.
married women, had the same legal status as children. So they relied on I said parents, Freudian slip, but on their husbands, um, you know, for permission to do all kinds of things. And this actually remained the case in France well into the 20th century, up into the 1960s.
Wow. Well, and to add that George, I mean, she took the name, a male name. Let's go to the next slide where you can see where we stopped to see where she lived here. This was up the street from Colette's home. Again, there's a plaque there and everything, but she changed her name. Why exactly?
Yeah, so she was really unhappy in this marriage, and eventually she leaves, and she meets this young lover whose name was Jules Sandeau. And Jules Sandeau was actually the one who encouraged her to begin writing so that she could support herself.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first novel that she had published, she actually collaborated with this lover, with Jules Sandeau. And the name, this novel was signed J. Sand. She wanted to be ambiguous. That was kind of deliberately so. She didn't necessarily want to take a man's name straight away, but she was deliberately ambiguous with the J. Sand. And then for her next novel, because she was no longer with this lover, and because they were no longer publishing anything together, she changed the J to a G. Mm-hmm. And then from there, she chose a name, Georges, which was actually a working class man's name from the region that she'd grown up in Burgundy, in Bourgogne. And, sort of harking back to her own roots. And she also, interestingly, I think, chose to spell the name Georges in an English way, not with an
exactly,
S.
Without the S, yeah.
Which again kind of adds to her androgyny and like ambiguity.
Mm-hmm. And also, were women writers, was it harder for them, so that if they had a male name, it would be easier for them to get published?
I mean, 100%.
Yeah.
If women's writing in France wasn't taken seriously for a long time. It arguably still is not seen as important as men's writing. Yeah. Women's writing was seen to be kind of frivolous and trivial. And
I love this slide. I picked this because here's inside the apartment with a very feminine bedroom, you might say. And then this picture of her smoking, which I gather was scandalous at that time, wearing sort of male attire, which she did, didn't she?
That's a picture. I think that's a picture of Colette, but yes,
okay.
Both Colette and Sand were like cross dressers.
Yeah.
And Georges Sand, got quite a name for doing that. But it was, necessary to do so, because that way you could get into places that were off limits. You could actually participate in public life women were kept to the home, and that's not going to inspire your writing, is it?
Well, the women were really adventurous and having the next slide that we have also shows the different. I mean, again, also very, very prolific, but the 9-year relationship she had with the composer Frédéric Chopin. And I remember reading, Heidi, about this after we talked, just saying that, at first he found her very unattractive because she dressed sort of like a very, very androgynous and like a male, but then he got to know her and really appreciated her as a literary genius, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think this relationship was quite late in his life.
Later in her life, yeah.
But in his life especially, and he wasn't very able bodily, but they did have a very special relationship. I think one thing, I don't know if my grandfather was watching, but I remember telling my grandfather about this tour and telling him about the different women that we talked about, and he knew Georges Sand as the mistress of Chopin. So I was reminded again why I'm doing these tours.
Yeah. And was it a tumultuous relationship, or did they get along for those 9 years?
I think it was not short on its dramas, and there was definitely a bit of scandal over him preferring her daughter at some point as well. If I'm
okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the last woman we're going to talk about here, Sylvia Beach. So tell us about her.
Yeah, so Sylvia Beach, she stands out quite a lot on this tour because two reasons. Firstly, she's not French, she's American.
Yep.
And secondly, she's not a writer, but she is certainly a very important literary figure.
Yeah.
And she was the owner of the Shakespeare Company in Paris.
Original. Yeah, we've got a couple of shots of that as we talk about it. There's the plaque and the story. And you say, is that a new plaque that's gone up there?
No, the new plaque is about her girlfriend.
Oh, yes, which we're going to talk about in a second, yes. Yes, I remember this.
So Sylvia Beach opens the Shakespeare Company, and it was originally at one address, and then it moved to the Rue de l'Odéon, and that's where it was for the longest. And this is where, Hemingway would come. Hemingway was a great friend of Sylvia Beach's, Gertrude Stein, Ezra Pound. All of these English-speaking writers in Paris at that time are coming to the Shakespeare Company. They're meeting there, incredibly important hub. And she was also the publisher, and this is what the plaque there tells you.
And we have another shot of that in the next slide, too. Yeah, go to this one. This is with James Joyce, the writer of Ulysses.
Yeah.
So tell us, she actually took a huge risk on that, didn't she?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think she was actually approached by somebody, I don't remember who exactly it was, afterwards asking if she would publish their work, and she just was straight away, no, thank you, I'm not doing that again. It was kind of, I think, a bit traumatizing for her. It took 2 years, around 2 years to complete the publications. She was financing it herself. She was working day and night. Because the book was banned. I mean, it was banned. You couldn't easily get copies to the people that were buying the copies, in the States and the UK. And so she took on a huge risk. It was also quite a big risk to her reputation. She had a Christian background, and the book had been labeled as pornography. It was considered to be pornographic. Because there's a scene of a woman masturbating. Goodness me, women shouldn't do that. Terrible, terrible things.
Yeah.
But I think she saw this book as such an important work of literature, completely at odds with what we've seen before, a stream of consciousness, but also in a way transgressive, but in a way sort of validating certain members of society who were viewed to be very transgressive and delinquent. And I guess Sylvia Beach, in being a queer woman, perhaps saw herself in that camp, and so saw this book as being really important.
Did
Yeah.
you, during your, when you were taking English literature, have to read Ulysses? Did you read it? Have you read it? Could I ask you that? It's kind of almost a personal question because when people ask, people go, no, I've never read it. You know, I have not read it. My brother has read it, but I have not.
It,
Yeah.
yes, I have read sections of it. I did not read it from cover
Well
to cover.
done, girl.
I was supposed to, but yeah, it was so long.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a major achievement. Let's go to the last slide because Sylvia also was very, well, here's the story. For those of you who don't know Shakespeare and Company, in Paris, this is the most famous English bookstore that's been around. It has changed hands and well, Heidi, tell us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this book the big there, excuse me, this shop. I keep thinking saying shop and then saying shop, is only really related to Sylvia Beach's bookshop by name.
Yeah.
It's a completely different owner, George Whitman, and it was opened 10 years after Sylvia Beach's shop during the World War. And it was really only renamed Shakespeare and Company as a tribute to Sylvia
Her.
Beach.
Yeah.
Because George Whitman was such a big fan of Sylvia Beach's.
Yeah, and if you've ever been, and you have, it's a tiny little place, very charming, but it's like something from another world, right? And people flock from all over the world to that bookstore now, and it's still remembered that this is her idea. So,
Yeah.
which is wonderful. Let's go to the last slide about Sylvia to say again, she was way ahead of her time. She had a relationship with another woman who had a bookstore across the street.
Yeah, and this is really what gave Sylvia the confidence, I think, to open the Shakespeare and Company. She met Adrienne Monnier, at Adrienne's bookshop, which was called La Maison des Amis des Livres, which is like the house of the friends of books.
Mm-hmm.
Adrienne had been, one of the first women in France to open and run a business. So very inspiring. And I mean, I say they were in a relationship. There's no doubt about the fact that they were in a relationship. These two women, they lived together for several years. But Sylvia was always very private about her private life. So she wasn't like some other lesbians in Paris who were sort of parading it around in a much more obvious visual way.
Mm-hmm.
She wasn't doing that. But
So, and again, that must have been difficult anyway, Yeah.
Yeah, although I think Paris, I mean, I know that Paris at that time was so much more liberal and so much,
Yeah.
You could really, in certain circles, be quite openly gay, and that was fine. And
Yeah, it was part of the lost generation. Yeah, the 20s.
People like Gertrude Stein and Sylvia Beach were moving to Paris so that they could have that relative.
Oh, that's great. All right. Well, thank you. That's so interesting. And if anybody wants to go and look up those names again, of the three of those women, can I just ask you, who do you think you'd like to have known personally the best? Yeah.
Probably Colette. But I don't have a really good answer for why.
I was thinking about it. I think I'd like to, George Sand would have been my pick. I think I would have liked to have sat down and interviewed her and talked to her, about her life. Because she was much earlier than the other two anyway. So, yeah. Anyway, let's move on. I wanted just to show maybe some holiday cheer here. And so that, for a lot of people who don't know Paris at Christmas, the lights are unbelievable. And have you been to see, Heidi, the Galerie Lafayette, which is the picture of the on the right-hand side there? It's a little bit more subdued than other years in terms of color, I found.
I haven't been there myself yet. I need to go. I'm going to try and go this weekend, I think.
Yeah. It's one of definitely, if you're in Paris, you go and visit that to see it, because it's an enormous rotunda with the stained glass windows above. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful settings for shopping in the world, right? Yeah. And I think you took some other pictures for us a little bit on this street. Can we go to that? Adam, have you got those set up? Yeah, I can just show us some of the pictures. Where is this?
That's the BHV department store right by the Hotel de Ville, which is looking really
there.
special. And they have hot chocolate, vin chaud.
Is that what you could get, that little stand there, hot chocolate? Oh yeah, I see that. Oh, how lovely. Wow.
Warm your hands as you shop.
Looking down the street.
These are some displays. I thought they were quite cute. They're not quite as spectacular as the displays in the Galerie Lafayette. That's definitely worth.
Yeah, they have amazing. A lot of people, you can go to YouTube and see the display at Galerie Lafayette this year. Quite something to see. Beautiful. Yeah. And thank you for going out on the street. Also, you've got some new tours coming up. So we have a slide to show that as well. I think. There we go. Yeah. So tell us, you've got two new ones there, and one which we're going to talk about in a minute too.
Yeah, really exciting. So we've just launched the new tour called Paris Stylé, which is like kind of stylish Paris, the women who made haute couture. So this tour was actually researched and written by one of my former guides, who is a art and fashion history major. And so she was running tours for me over the summer, and then came to me and asked me if she could write this tour. And of course I said yes, because it's such a fantastic idea. So this tour takes place in what's called the Triangle d'Or, like the Golden Triangle.
Golden Triangle, yeah. And tell people where that is, more or less.
Yeah, so it starts in the Place Vendôme. The Place Vendôme is just behind the Louvre, slightly kind of
on the right bank. Yeah.
On the right bank, but like not too far from the Tuileries.
Beautiful.
And, yeah. And so we're going to be talking about 5 different designers who all, really influenced the way that we dress today.
Oh, wow. That would be fun. Well, that's a bit, that's what Paris is about too. So, and what's the other one you're doing?
So the other one is called Liberté, Égalité, Viennoiserie. It doesn't quite work, the rhyme, but it works if you say it in that way. Okay. So a viennoiserie is a pastry. It's a word that the French use for pastries. And liberté, égalité, fraternité is the kind of motto of the French, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. So this tour, we are going to be meeting at the Marché d'Aligre, which is a food market in Paris, in the east of Paris. And it was here that a group of market women actually began a protest, which then resulted in the attack on Versailles and the arrest of the king and the queen during the French Revolution.
Oh, okay.
So what this tour is going to be focusing on is women's role in the revolution, and the women of this market, past and present, because we're also going to visit some of the market women there today and have tastings from their stalls.
Oh, this sounds exciting. And you've, since I've been to Paris, you've also set up sort of a virtual tour. So let's go to the slide, because I'm going to give away those right now to people. So tell us about this tour. How do you do this virtually?
Yeah, so this was something that we put together in 2020 and early 2021, obviously when people weren't allowed to travel and no one was coming to Paris. And so this is a virtual version of the tour that you took with me, the Sugar and Spice and Women Who Write tour. So it's the stories of these writers with whom we've just spoken about. And you're going to see scenes of Paris in the summer and in the winter, because we filmed sections in both seasons.
And bring your own chocolate and caramels and
yes, your own snacks.
I like that. You don't have to leave your own house. That's great. So what I want to do is give away 3 of these right now. Also, if you have any questions, Mark, you'll tell us in a minute if there are. But what I want you to do, and you see this slide is important to notice now. You see my email there, diana@womanofacertainageInParis.com. I want you to, if you're interested in receiving this tour, just to email me at that address. And the first 3 people that get through to me win the tours. And I'll be in touch with you about that. So, Mark, do we have any questions from anybody? Or Do you have any questions too? Sometimes.
I have a couple of questions. A couple got answered when as the program went on.
Okay.
Now, Michelle has one question. I'm not sure the relativity, but I think it's a fair question. She wants to know if you were the one implicated in the filming of The Real Girlfriends in Paris on Bravo. Was that you?
I've got no idea what she's talking about.
All right. So then I guess the answer for Michelle is no, that wasn't
definitely
you.
no. And you haven't been an Emily in Paris in the show that's is very, very popular on Netflix and whatever. No, not even as a stand-in somewhere. You'd be great.
Not my thing.
I think so.
Not your thing. I can see that.
So now I'm not sure if you answered her question in in the things you had shared, because I know you talked about some of these things. But Margaret wanted to know who, of the women over the years, like who were villainized, because you did kind of start the program of how these women get villainized. So maybe you can answer that a little bit more detail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sure. So it's really the queens of Paris, of France, excuse me. So if you think about Marie Antoinette, Marie de Medici, Marie and Catherine de Medici, all three of whom very famous but really bad reputations, and especially Catherine de Medici was considered.
And tell people a little about her because I have written about her in my blogs, but they may not remember that. Yeah. So tell us about her.
She was Queen Regent of France for 30 years.
Long time.
Yeah, long time. I mean, during that time, she was pretty much the most powerful woman in Europe. And she ruled alongside three of her sons who wanted to keep her in that role as regent because she was such a strong leader. She was such a strong negotiator. They wanted their mum supporting them. But yeah, she was quite badly viewed in the years after, and also because she was not only foreign, she was not only a woman, but she was also a foreign woman. And so the French didn't really look that kindly on her.
Yeah, and that's probably true around the world. But did you find that this was more in France? Women were more negatively looked at. Are they further behind than the rest of the Western world in that way?
I mean, I think that's a big question that I would probably need to spend a bit more time answering. But just one thing that I guess is quite poignant for me, coming as a girl from London, where we in the UK we allowed women to rule. France never allowed women to rule. They were only able to as Queen Regent, so they're only stepping in for their husband or their son. Whereas in the UK, I would say that all of our best monarchs were women.
That's a very good point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to end on that note. So I hope those of you are emailing me at diana@womanofacertainageInParis.com for those 3 tours. But I really want to thank all of you for joining in and signing up for this interview, especially since it's the last one of the series. I really appreciate your support, and I've enjoyed it so much. A very special thank you to Heidi today. Kudos to you, Heidi, for taking the initiative to build on your education and your knowledge, find a neglected gap in the marketplace, and create a business around your passion to expand our awareness of women who have left their mark on Paris. Truly inspirational. I look forward to taking more of your tours. And the guys in Vancouver, thank you, Mark, and the team in Vancouver. Thank you to all of you who've signed up for this series this year. I have to say it really has been a labor of love, because as a journalist, I thrived on finding and telling women's stories as well. And I'm so happy to realize this passion of my own with the worthy women of global interest like Heidi that I've interviewed this year. And before I leave, I have to just say something about I'm starting something new in 2023, and I'm really excited about it. It's called the Paris Fan Club. The Paris Fan Club. It will be entirely focused on Paris and all things French, and it will provide a community for all of you to join and participate in live, hands-on events that will teach us how to do things. basic things that I've always wanted to learn, like tie a scarf like a Parisian, or find my inner French girl, or create a toolkit of French phrases to use when you're in Paris or France. Maybe even take another walking tour with Heidi. Wouldn't that be great, Heidi? And so much more. Good. Most exciting for me, though, is I've created something called the Paris Travel Kit, because lots of people were asking me, so what do you take to Paris with you? So I've created this, and I now have 8 items designed uniquely with my brand that I personally take to Paris and, in fact, anywhere I travel. So stay tuned. All of this is coming up in the new year, and you'll be hearing about it. Bye for now. Happy holidays to everyone, and we leave you with Heidi's info so that you can follow or contact her, and I hope you will. I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. So, cue closing slides, and goodbye all.